All right, good morning, everybody. One more week, and we know what's... I don't want to jinx it. All right. Everybody get along okay with last month's block? Yes. Good. I'm glad. All right, this time we're doing this one, Star in a Star. Has quite a few pieces, but please do not let that intimidate you, okay? I want to bring up a couple of things that were asked last time after we met. I had somebody that brought in a sample of their sewing, and they're asking why something didn't fit. And what was happening was, at the beginning and end of your seam, being true to your seam allowance is really important. And they had started a little deep and ended a little narrow. And so, sometimes, I'm at the end of my seam, zoom, and then, we kind of go crooked. So stay true to your seam allowance beginning to end, and look at it. Make sure it's the same seam allowance all the way across. Also had somebody ask, when we were snowballing the corners, I just generically said trim them off. But they asked, do I trim both layers? And I'd never had anybody ask me that before. New thing. So yes, we trim both layers. Purpose is to try and keep your quilt about the same thickness all the way across. Now, I do know some people who do not trim anything. And of course, there's a lot of thickness as you go along when you add your additional pieces. And their quilter seems to get along okay with that. But I don't recommend it because it makes some of your blocks kind of bulky. So I also had somebody say, why do we make things bigger and trim them down? Good question. So a couple reasons. I had a couple ladies at the first that piped up immediately. Insurance policy. So yes, having a little extra that you can square up ensures that you do have enough to make it the right size. But another reason we do it is just because for instance, if we were doing a 2.5 inch half square triangle, we would cut our pieces 2 7/8. And I couldn't even tell you how many complaints I'd have if we always cut things on the 7/8 or the 5/8 or the 3/8. Now we do have a little of that this time. So two reasons. Simplicity, so you can find the lines on your ruler easy. And secondly, so you have a little bit of extra to make sure it's the right size when you're done. Okay, this time on your cutting, we have more pieces, and they aren't all just in a row. It's easy to do your cutting when you just have one long strip and you just go boom, boom, boom and cut them all. This time, your light, your background, and your orange, we have a rectangle to cut out of, okay? Now, on your, when this happens, you need to look at your diagram and make sure you have your piece oriented the same way as the cutting. So like this time, we've got rectangles and 2 squares. And so you need to make sure that the piece that you have, let me see, this would be about 14 or 14.5 inches long. Make sure you have that oriented that way and that you don't have it turned the other way. Because then your pieces may not fit and you're dipping into your oops kit, okay? Same way with your medium orange. You've got one way where we have 2.5 inch squares all the way across, but then the other way we have the same number of 2.5 inch squares, but then we have another row of 1.5 inch squares. So again, just make sure you have it oriented correctly, because that's what the oops kit's for, but if you don't dip into it, that's even better. At first session, I had a lady who said, I use my chalk pencil and I draw all of my pieces on with a chalk pencil before I start cutting to make sure that I have it oriented right and that everything's going to fit. I'm passing that on because I thought it was a great tip. So, okay. So any questions about cutting? Okay. All right. So let's get into our block. So, we're doing snowballing again on the corners. I'm not going to go through that just because we did it last month. But you'll do your four corners, and you draw on the drawn line and press it back towards the corner, trim it off. You'll have 4 of those, and those start with 4-inch squares. Now you have 1 4 1/4 inch square of your light also. So make sure you don't use your 4 1/4 on this step. Use your 4 inches, okay? All right. Then step 2, we're making kind of what looks like a flying goose, except normally with a flying goose, the pieces cross in the middle, and this time they don't. It's a kind of an extended goose or whatever. Again, we are snowballing the corners, and just make sure that they are coming together that the angles are opposite so they come in to the center. All right, you'll trim those off again. And when you're done, this piece will, you start out with a rectangle that's 5 1/2 by 2 1/2. So this unit will remain 5 1/2 by 2 1/2 when you're done. Okay. Next step we're doing is flying geese, which we have not done this time. Oh, one thing I also, in your cutting, you've got one line of 8 2 1/2 inch squares of the medium orange and a line of 5 squares of 2 1/2 inches. Okay, we used 4 of them in this step and 8 of them in this step. So you have one left that's ultimately going to become the center of your square. So just saying, don't question that you have one left. Okay, now we're going to make flying geese in step 3. Now you have your 4 1/4 inch light and your dark green 2 3/8. So that's one of those times when we use the 3/8, the 1/8 of an inch instead of on a 1/2 or a inch. Okay, you're going to draw a line diagonally on all 4 of your dark green squares, and you're going to put them on opposite diagonal corners, and they do overlap in the middle. And I'll show you that on camera. They do overlap in the middle. Okay, you're going to sew 1/4 inch on either side of that drawn line, or if you're using your marking tool and you've drawn your lines, you're going to sew on those. You're going to cut that in half on that diagonal, on that center diagonal. And you end up with 2 of these kind of weird heart-shaped units. And you're going to press towards that green, the dark green. Okay, then you still have 2 of your 2 3/8 inch dark green, and you line those up on that corner of the light. And again, you'll sew 1/4 inch on either side. When you're done, you're going to end up with one goose this way and one goose that way. And I'll show that on camera also. So you're going to have sewn on either side of that line, and you'll have one goose going this way. Again, you'll cut that on that line, and then you'll have one goose this way. Since you have 2 of these, you'll end up with 4 geese. Right. That's why you only need one 4 1/2. Yes. Okay. Or 4 1/4. Sorry, 4 1/4. Okay. Now, with this method, they are very close to the right size. Sometimes they're a little wonky. Mine get that way sometimes. I do use a trimming tool. You can do it with a regular square that has a 45-degree line that you would line up on your slant. And I'm going to put it up here so you can see it a little better. This already has its seam allowances off on 3 sides. Okay, so it's smaller than what we will trim it up to. The pattern does not say it, but you're going to square it to 2 inches by 3 1/2 inches. Okay? This is number 3, your flying geese. You square it to 2 inches by 3.5 inches. So this is the wing clipper 1, which is my favorite of the flying geese. There are a zillion trimming tools. Okay, if you already have one, use what you have. If you don't have one and you want one, of course we can help you out. Okay, this has 2 by, and again, it's wing clipper 1. Mine is so old that she didn't have a wing clipper 2 then, so mine just says wing clipper. But if it's a newer one, it'll say wing clipper 1. So we're doing, there is a V on this ruler. Let me bring this up so they'll be able to see it on camera. So see these V's that are all different sizes. Okay. You start with your, okay, on a flying goose, we refer to the pointy part as the goose and the outside as the sky. And that's because geese fly in, they swim, they fly in formation. So that's why, so I'm talking about the goose here. You make sure the goose is on the top. And see, I've got a seam allowance, a dotted line here that has my seam allowance. So you can tell that it's hanging out of that. Okay. My edges are bigger than the goose is because my seam allowances are off. But that goose point just sits right in that V, okay? And then you're going to trim around the first 2 sides. Okay, you leave your ruler in the same orientation and you flip your goose around. And this time, then this would be, let me put this down where it would be. Okay. Again, my seam allowances are off of it. So, and this piece wouldn't be attached. So you would trim your other 2 sides. Now, on this one, the orientation, there's this X at the top. There's all these different X's all the way across. And that just sits right in your V again, but it shows you where your 1/4 inch seam allowance is. And so then you just trim the other 2 sides. So that's how that ruler works. But you can do the same thing with a regular ruler just by lining up your 45-degree line and making sure you have your size and then squaring it up and turning it and squaring it up again. So, but you probably won't need to trim off more than just little slivers just to make sure that it's the right size. Okay? All right. Now, step 4, we're doing little pieces, and sometimes little pieces are scary for people, okay? Because you don't have that great big piece of fabric to guide, through your machine. So we're using 1.5 inch squares of orange and 1.5 by 2 inch light pieces. Now, it's this same exact technique that we did in these first 2, it's just smaller pieces. So you're going to be drawing your line like always on diagonally, but then you line it up on your 1.5 by 2 rectangle, and then you're going to be sewing on this line. Now, I usually start, when I'm doing any of these, I usually start on the side. I don't usually start in the corner because the needle can kind of pull that down in the machine. So I will start on this flat side and go up, and then I'll chain piece them all, just one right after the other, so I don't pull it out and have, long tails in between. That's another way to kind of help keep it from sinking down into the machine. Okay. Now, one thing that I do this on all of these, but one thing particularly, I glue these instead of pinning them. And the reason I do that is because, again, when it's small or big, they can wiggle around. And if you pin them, sometimes when you go, they can just shift. So there's lots of glue products. There's lots of, this is called Glue Based It, and it has little very small tip. So you don't get, big blob at one time. But when I'm gluing, you put it on the right side of your fabric, which seems weird because you don't usually do anything to the right side of your fabric except put them together. But I'll put a dot, I'll put 3 dots, and it'll be on the side that I'm going to trim off. And then I just lay it on there, press it on there, and let it dry. I go ahead and glue them all at the same time, so then by the time I'm done with them, the first ones are dry, and then I can go through and sew them. If you're doing just 1 or 2, you can set it with the iron if you need to dry it before you sew it. But anyhow, then it doesn't wiggle when you sew it. So anyhow, there's lots of products. There's lots of, I don't know, we even had not too long ago a tip that you put on your Elmer's or something that made a smaller amount come out. I mean, there's lots of different things. So, but a water-soluble glue is great to help keep things from shifting around. Okay, now when we're going to make 8 of these, 4 of them with the slant going one way and 4 of them with the slant going the other. Make sure that you have 4 of each before you trim them off. Okay, so they're going to remain this 1.5 by 2 size that we started with on our light. Okay. Then step 5, we're making what she calls a variable 9 patch. And that's because you have rectangular pieces and squares. Okay. These lights are 2 by 2.5. These are 2-inch squares, and this is a 2.5-inch square. So when you're making these 2 rows, the short side of your rectangle goes along with your green, and you press out towards the green. This center one, the long sides go against the orange, and it's pressed towards the orange, and then another of the green. So then when you put them all together, then those seams nest, the seam allowances nest. When you sew those seams, then you'll press it towards the center. That unit will measure 5.5 inches square, and that is not on your pattern. On what? On the very light, it says 2.5-inch squares. Oh, nope. That's one of those times. Go by your pattern. The very lights are 2 by 2.5. Yes. Always go by the pattern. That cutting diagram is only to let you know how we laid them out, not as the Bible for cutting. The Bible for cutting is always the pattern. I'm sorry, what? The very light. Yes, the very lights are cut 2 by 2.5. On the cutting diagram, it just says 2.5. Okay, so make sure it should be a 2 by 2.5. Yes, I'm glad you caught that. Whoever brought that up. Thank you. Okay. Huh? The top one. The top one. Yes, the VL should be 2 by 2.5. Okay. We are to step 6. So now, all 4 of the very lights are 2 by 2.5. Yep. And again, refer to your pattern. Okay, so now we are ready to make this unit here. So take your flying goose and make sure that you have it with the points going up, and you're going to put one of these little guys on either side. Make sure they're opposite of each other, and make sure the slants are going in, and that ends up making this kind of hook shape here. I've seen it the other way because a friend of mine already made her block, and she reversed all these and she made a totally different shape. So, and you know, she didn't take it out. It's going to be that way because she figured it out after the block was completely done, and she's not going to take it apart. So the way it was written is that it will make this hook shape. If it doesn't do that, you may have it going the wrong way. Okay, you'll sew one to either side of it, and they're pressed out away from the goose. And that unit will measure 2 by 5.5. 2 by 5.5? This bottom here. This bottom here is 2 by 5.5, and that's in step 6. Okay, step 7, we're just adding the unit we made in step 2 to the top of it. And there's nothing to match there, except your outside edges. Well, now your points, your points will hope, yeah. And that's another, I'm glad you brought that up, because another thing you can do is sew it from this side, and then you can tell that your stitches are going where the seams cross each other diagonally. If you sew far enough in, if you sew past where they cross, you're going to cut off your points. If you sew inside of that, they're going to float a little bit. It's always better to float than be cut off. So, just saying. Okay. So this unit, once it's on, it's going to be 4 by 5.5. Okay, we don't have a step 8. I don't know why, but we don't have a step 8. So step 9, we're putting it all together. Huh? Step 8 is have a drink. There you go. Have a drink and chill a little bit. You're past the hard part. Okay. So you're going to make your 3, she calls them columns, I call them rows, doesn't matter, same thing. Okay, you'll have 2 rows like this, where you sew your corner units to the outside of the unit we made in step 7, and then you'll press those away from the center. Okay, this one you're going to have two of these units, and I don't have 2 of them to show you, but you'll have those, the center will be that, and then another row of these. This row, there's little arrows. So this row is pressed towards the center. These are pressed out. And that's our block. Not bad, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Okay. All right. I have faith in you. Those little guys are not going to trip you up. I already know that. Okay. What's the size of the finished block? 12.5. 12.5 now. It's actually 12-inch finished when all the sleeves are. Yep. But at this point, it's 12.5. Okay.